Okay, I got it. Before I let Mark introduce himself, I'm going to share over the holidays, one of the reasons I go into transition, I had gotten a Christmas card from a young man that had autism, had struggled a little bit with high school, didn't know what he wanted to do for work, kind of jumped between jobs and eventually was hired on with the city in the sanitary area. But this Christmas card, it's got a picture of him standing in front of a window and it says decking new halls, and he's got this huge smile on his face and it says my new house. So he has purchased his own house and he's ready to start living independently in his own home. I love getting stuff like that. He wrote a little piece on there, Mrs. Kugel, I got a piece of the American dream. Good things happened to me because people saw my potential and gave me a chance. Thank you for being one of my believers. And it was just, it's an amazing card. It's going to be in my forever keep pile. But with that said, I will let Mark Ermintrout introduce himself and we will get underway because
Actually,
I do
wait.
Yep.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
I do not plan on going overtime with any of this, so we will be done by 5. If we get done sooner than that, I'm okay with that too, just so you guys know. All right, Mark, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks, Leah. Well, my name is Mark Ermintrout. I'm a Special Education Regional Coordinator at the DPI also. Part of my portfolios include graduation and dropout rates for students with disabilities, and I also coordinate the State Systemic Improvement Plan, the SIP, which is improving graduation rates for students identified as having an emotional disturbance. I think we're also all believers and partners in if we can improve outcomes for students identified with an emotional disturbance, the things we do in that area can generalize to all students with disabilities. And the reality is can actually generalize to improving outcomes for all students. I am so appreciative to be here this afternoon for all of Leah's work, for the work that each of you are doing during these uncharted times, and just excited about the opportunity to partner with Leah and to partner with each of you to think about not just compliance, but meaningful transition IEPs that make a difference in, as Leah described, in achieving the American dream.
I'm going to go ahead and start sharing the screen. I do want to let you know that both Mark and I are very informal presenters. So if at any time anybody wants to jump in and ask questions, I will have, you can see that I'm not looking directly at my camera. I'm working with 3 computer screens right now. So I will have on the side of me the comment section open. I hope if I can figure out how to make this work, so I can be able to watch the comments also, and Mark will help out a little bit. But with that, we are going to talk about graduation, dropout, and writing transition IEPs. And like Mark said, we're not going to concentrate, even though I'm going to show you how to write transition IEPs that are compliant for monitoring purposes. I want you to remember that if we write a compliant IEP and we include the stuff that we're doing with the student, we include the student in the IEP, that we're writing an IEP that is beneficial to that student as far as getting through high school, graduating from high school, and obtaining those post-secondary goals that he or she may have. Mark is going to present first with the graduation and some dropout data, and then I will jump in and out with some of the transition IEP writing information. Don't hesitate to ask questions if you have any. Okay, I guess I have this first one. I did want to state from the IDEA regulations, the purpose of why do we have IDEA? Why is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act even out there? This is the reason that the federal government provides as to why we have IDEA, and it's to ensure that all children have available a free appropriate public education, or what we call FAPE, that emphasizes special education and related services that meets their individualized needs. The part that I have highlighted, this is how we know that it's tied into the transition part of the school too. It is to prepare them for further education, further employment, and further independent living. What I like, this purpose of IDEA was written many, many years ago. And then ESSA came in and North Dakota wrote that Choice Ready rubric that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And in that Choice Ready rubric, we can have students that choose to be Choice Ready in post-secondary education, in employment, or in military or life skills activities. So they tie very well together. Mark, is this you?
I was thinking you had them for a little bit.
Okay. So what this shows is this is all of the kids that are in special education in the state of North Dakota from December 2010 up until 2019. What I wanted to show with this slide is the steady increase. And I think we all know as professionals that there is an increase in the number of students moving into our state, moving into our schools, and a number of students being identified with special education. So in 2019, we had a total of 16,459 students identified. This is how it looks if we look at the disability by ages. This is the 2019 data. So if we look, your highest areas of identification is when the student is 8 years old, 9 years old, 7 years old, and then again at 13 years old. And then it starts to drop out when we start hitting the transition ages. The 18 to 21 makes sense because we do have a lot of our students graduate. When they turn 18, we have a few that decide to stay. This again is just another chart that shows who are our transition age students in North Dakota. We do have a few 14 and 15-year-olds because if the team feels that it's appropriate to write an IEP for a student that is 14 or 15 that's transition based, they sure can go ahead and do that. It's just going to improve the outcomes when the student exits high school. So our biggest category, probably not surprising, is SLD. Next biggest category is OHI. And then the lower categories are some of the pretty rare disabilities that we see, like deaf blindness and visual impairments.
So I would just like to invite you to maybe just reflect on your individual caseload or individuals you work with, and just think about the students, what their choice ready outcomes, what they're hoping, what they're desiring. You know, I go back and I think about, for example, Matt was a student that I knew. Matt had an IDEA, identified emotional disturbance. He was a pretty low-key guy. Basically did what he needed to do to get by in school. But then one day pulled a knife on some students at school. So obviously that changed things. But the end goal was still the same as far as that Matt would graduate choice ready. We had to adjust some of the ways that we as a school and community were addressing that. But just invite you to think about individual students who are on your caseload. I think about Pat. Pat was a student. He was maybe 8th or 9th grade when I met him. He was a sophomore in high school when his father committed suicide. And he lived in a small town. He worked to support he and his younger brother. He lived 2 blocks from a school, and there was just this love-hate relationship. Sometimes I share just real briefly about these individual students as they both graduated from school choice ready, and went on and are currently kind of like that individual that Leah was describing, living successful, productive lives. I share this slide as a department, the Department of Public Instruction. On the left side, you see the strategic vision framework, increasing students who enter kindergarten prepared to learn, and then reading by 3rd grade, increase students who are making expected learning grades. But the fifth bullet point down, increasing students who graduate choice ready. This is the strategic vision for, that came out of the Children's Services Coordinating Council. And so that's what we're looking at as far as a state. Right next to that is our North Dakota Choice Ready framework that Leah mentioned, where every student who graduates from high school will graduate either ready for post-secondary experiences, ready for the workforce, or ready for the military. And then you're likely familiar with the high school accountability pie, graduation, graduating choice ready, school completion. Those are all parts of that accountability pie. All of these, they're not separate individual entities. I mean, they are, but they're all aligned at the same concept of supporting students so that when they leave schools after graduating, that they are ready for the world that is before them. If we go to the next slide, Leah, just a real quick overview. That blue line at the top of the graph is the trend line for students, all students in North Dakota, their graduation rates. And graduation rates for all students in North Dakota are decent, over 88%. If we think about students with disabilities in North Dakota, that drops a fair amount. Last year, 2019-20, the graduation rate, that's the red line, was 73%. You can see over the past 3 to 4 years, that trend line has started to move in the right direction again. Between 18 and 19, that was when the pandemic struck. So the momentum, instead of continuing to increase, flatlined. And I'd be curious at some point if you have thoughts on predicting what's going to happen this year. And we may continue to see implications in the years to come from the just working through navigating the pandemic. While there's challenges, there's still opportunities that maybe we can leverage as a part of this process. The last line there.
Is anyone brave enough to answer Mark's question or concern about whether or not we think that these graduation rates are going to stay stagnant like they were the last couple of years, or due to COVID, do we think that we're going to have more that are going to graduate or possibly less that are going to graduate?
I was talking with our data expert, internal data expert yesterday, and we were talking about, for example, are there certain students who maybe aren't earning all their credits right now? And so maybe if we as school personnel can continue to engage, I wonder if we might be able to, if our 5-year graduation rate we'll see more students graduating after 5 years instead of just 4 years. But I don't know. Anybody have a thought? Less will graduate? That's a concern. So on the goal through all of this, we talk about closing the achievement gap for reading between students with disabilities and students without disabilities. We talk about closing the achievement gap in math proficiency for students with and without disabilities. We also wrestle with this as far as an achievement gap in the graduation rates for students with and without disabilities. So this just this just breaks it out into a variety of different subgroups. Whether you're a student who experiences homelessness or who has an IEP or who is identified as low income or Native American. If you oftentimes are part of one of these subgroups, there tends to be, our data suggests there's more likelihood of an achievement gap, something that as schools, as we work with our partners, as we work with students, always mindful about, in this case, how are we pulling together the team to do meaningful IEPs that support graduation rates, because we know that every one of these numbers is an actual student. We go to the next slide. So this just breaks it out by racial and ethnic subgroups. You can see students who identify as white have a 76% graduation rate. These are students with disabilities. Students who identify as Black or African American have a 58%. Next slide, please. If we look at different disability groups, if you are identified as having a specific learning disability, your odds of graduating, the data suggests, is 81%, although that is actually one of the areas that's declined a little bit. If you're a student with an intellectual disability or an emotional disturbance, the chances of graduating are 56% of this subgroup of students graduate. Let's keep going. If we look at LRE, curious if this is what you would predict. The data consistently shows that students who are served in their less restrictive environment have an increased likelihood, or more students graduate who are in less restrictive environments. And there can be many ways to approach that data. This is just the peer data. Next slide, please. So just to kind of put it all together, students who are most likely to graduate, students who are in the regular classroom, 80% of these students graduate. Those are in the least restrictive environment as noted on the IEP. Students with SLD or OHI are more likely to graduate. Students who are white or Asian, students with disabilities in these subgroups, are more likely to graduate. Students who are least likely to graduate, those are our students who are in separate schools or who are on homebound or home hospital. Students who are in the regular classroom for less than 40% of the day. So 20% of students in a separate school graduate from high school. And again, students with ID or ED are less likely to graduate than other students with disabilities. Let's keep going. Now, this is the flip side of that. It's not a one-for-one correlation. So if we look at students who drop out of high school, so our students who identify as Native American are the most likely to drop out. That trend is moving in the right direction, and a lot of progress has been made in North Dakota, but that's still the subgroup ethnicity-wise within students with disabilities who are most likely to drop out of school. Primary disability, if you have an emotional disturbance, 1 out of 3 students identified as having ED drop out of high school, whereas 2% of students identified as having autism drop out of high school. LRE, that has really gotten consolidated as far as regardless of which LRE you are receiving your services in, your special education services, 13 to 14% of students drop out of high school. So who's most likely to drop out? Or based on a 4-year cohort is students with ED. This one always challenges me, I guess. Students with a speech language impairment, and then students who are American Indian or Alaskan Native. Are there thoughts on the SLP one? On why students with an SLP are more likely to drop out? I mean, over a quarter of these students drop out of high school.
This is Liz, Mark. Liz
Hi,
Decker.
Liz.
Hi. I think maybe because those kids have like they don't qualify for other disability categories, and then they have struggles, and so it looks like that's all they are, but there might be other things going on. That's all I can think of.
So they might not be getting the supports
Right.
that they might need.
Right, because they're not learning disabled, they're not ID, they're not. So then, yeah, that would be my guess. That would be my only guess. Someone else probably has a better idea.
Let's hang on to that thought, Liz, as we come to a slide that says why North Dakota students with disabilities say they didn't graduate. That's an interesting comment.
There is a comment from Brittany that's kind of interesting too about the embarrassment if they're unable to correct their speech disabilities or deficiencies, and I could see that.
Yeah.
But
a lot of those kids are language kids, not me. I mean, some of them are speech kids, but
sure,
I would guess it's a language thing.
To Brittany's comment, look at this slide too. No, let's go to that next slide. So reasons students with disabilities didn't graduate, and these are taken from just summarizing some of the responses from the post-school outcomes survey. Students report they didn't like school, or anxiety, social skills, being bullied, school phobia, difficulty being in public. I wonder if that might get to potentially one way that might manifest is possible embarrassment. Some students reported they're pursuing the GED. Some have gone to work, or a lack of family support. Going to that thought that Liz shared, some students on IEPs reported that their disabilities got in the way of them being successful in school, so they dropped out, or they couldn't complete the course requirements, or they failed required courses. Anytime you have thoughts, jump in. So one of the images that I share somewhat frequently is this image. It's a cartoon-looking image, but it's also just a great reminder that the reality is when a student leaves school, when a student drops out of school without graduating, the reality is they're not at school anymore, but they are going to get picked up by somebody else. In this image, the data plays this image out that, well, this guy is saying we can't afford to save this one, but don't worry, someone will catch him. And the data continually shows that somebody will catch them, whether it's a gang type environment, whether it's the judicial system, the social service system, the healthcare system. If we go on to the next slide, the reality is, and these numbers always astound me, that for every student who drops out of high school, over the course of that student's lifetime, there is between a $300,000 and a $500,000 impact on the local community. So think about that for North Dakota. For every 1% of students who don't graduate, that's a $25 million cost to the state over the course of those students' lifetime. So there were 7,600 students, a little over that, in last year's graduation cohort. If we take 76 students, 1% times, I just took the middle between 300 and 500,000, $400,000. That's a conservative number, is $25 million. And that comes in reduced earning power by that student. If you don't have a graduate diploma, students who don't have a diploma earn less. Reduced spending power. So students who don't have a high school diploma buy fewer and less expensive boats and houses and go to the movies and spend less on rec leisure. And then increased interaction with community systems, whether that's healthcare, social services, the judicial system, whatever it might be. So keep in mind that North Dakota's 4-year graduation rate is 88%. So what do we do about it? We know that if we focus on it, we can make a difference. For example, in North Dakota, over the last 5 to 7 years, concerted efforts were made and are being made to support students who are Native American, to support graduation rates in this community or in these communities. And over that 5 to 7 years, graduation rates for students who are Native American have increased from 55% to 72 to 73%. We know if we focus on this, if we make concerted efforts and partner and work together, we can make a difference. So I'll talk about a couple areas real quick. If we could go to the next slide. So one is just continuing a consistent message that, you know, a student doesn't show up to high school, their senior year of high school in the spring and say, just one day decide to quit. The reality is decision points are made all the way along the way. In high school, we can go back to middle school, we can go all the way back to early literacy skills and begin to predict if students are straying off the path towards graduation. We'll talk more about that briefly in a minute. The other thing that, just as a part of that messaging, so dropping out is a process. It's not just an event. The other thing, this just ties so much into working with the team, working with the student, writing transition IEPs, just being mindful that all students have hopes and dreams. And so how do we leverage those hopes and dreams so that through the transition IEP process, so that student is more likely to graduate choice ready for post-secondary, the workforce, or the military? So another area that we can look at to see if students are on the pathway towards graduation or if they're beginning to stray off the pathway. There are early warning systems that have proven time and again to be effective at predicting when students are straying off the pathway towards graduation, and we can also use early warning systems to evaluate if the interventions that we're providing are making a difference to support that student getting back on the pathway to graduation. So an early warning system, it's basically the ABCs. A, attendance, behavior, and course completion. If we go to the next slide.
You know, before you do that, Mark, I just wanted to add, you know, not only is this improving graduation rates, but it's also going to improve services that we provide to those students that are transition aged. And it's also going to improve how we write our IEPs. If we have a student that has attendance issues, like Mark said, how are we going to address that in the IEP? How are we going to address it if behavior becomes a concern? Do we have to look at more assessment information? Do we have to add more accommodations and maybe modifications? Course completion, what can we do to enable the kid to now get the credit for the courses that they might have failed through credit recovery or other means.
I can envision, and we already do, but just being really intentional about having those discussions at IEP meetings about students' attendance. I mean, we talk about that. We talk about the behavior. We talk about course performance, but just continuing to ramp that up and how we intentionally use that information to make intervention and support decisions. So just looking at this a little bit more detailed, this is actually pulled, this is what our state longitudinal, data system, the SLED system uses. And so every school in North Dakota has access to the data that can support this. Our behavior data as a state is a little softer depending on your school and how you use it. But we know that, for example, in course performance, the C's of the ABCs, that if students are getting C's or betters in their classes, they're more likely to graduate. If they are failing a core course, they have strayed off the path towards graduation. We know that a GPA of 2.5 or higher is on the path towards graduation. If a student has a or less than a 2.0, they've strayed off the path towards graduations. In transition IEPs, it's not just a task to complete. What section is that? The credits? I should know that. T2, T3?
T2, sorry, I had my mic off when I was answering.
So the T2 section, where we're using credits and planning ahead, but that's also identifying students straying off the path towards graduation. Attendance. We know that students who miss more than 10% of the school year are more likely or less likely to graduate.
I think it's interesting. Whoops. I think it's interesting when I look at this chart and the comments that Mark has already said about the off track in the red. Usually the kids that are off track are not just going to have one of those columns met. They're going to have possibly 3 or 4 or 5 of those columns met. And again, how do we address it and how do we try to catch it early to get them back into the yellow or the green as we're working with them? Sorry, Mark.
No. I always think about attendance too, that 10% of the school year, that's 18 days. So that's if a student is consistently missing 1 to 2 days a month. I can think of students where that didn't necessarily trigger anything because it wasn't that frequent. But if a student's consistently missing 2 class periods a month, they're starting to get behind, maybe getting overwhelmed, just a part of that whole process. We'll keep going unless there's questions. So this is going back to that information from a little bit earlier on why do students drop out, and this is actually taken from North Dakota responses. And I just took some of the early warning system data and aligned this with why students say they drop out. Missing too many days, I mean, that's an attendance issue that shows up. They think it's easier to get a GED, course performance, poor grades, failing grades, course performance, don't like school, can't keep up with school. I wasn't sure pregnancy, work, not sure how that would tie into the ABCs, but it could. And then not getting along, don't feel like I belong. It also ties into the 3 R's you can see on the right side. The students who drop out from school will consistently show a theme of saying, the material wasn't relevant to my life. And whether that's true or not, it's the perception on whether it was relevant or not. Or it's identified that there wasn't at least one meaningful relationship, whether that's with an adult, a meaningful adult in their life in school, or rigor. The work was too hard, or we were having a discussion the other day. We also talked about, for some of our students, if their behavior starts to escalate, we really ramp the difficulty of the curriculum back, and that could actually be counterproductive. So as we think about, knowing what to do, I talk frequently about the 15 effective strategies from the National Dropout Prevention Center. There's over 30 years of research into these strategies on what works in reducing dropout rates, improving graduation rates. They're broken out into 4 different areas: that foundational, early intervention, basic core, managing and improving instruction. Again, dropping out is a process. It's not a single event. It starts with, how is your system working together to support all students? It relates to schools and communities partnering together. You can just improve one of these and it'll make a difference. But to have maximum effect, these strategies work together. Just for example, school community collaboration. If we have good school community collaboration, we don't have to complain about a basic core strategy of mentors, tutors. We can get mentors and tutors. We can have access to job-related experiences, career and technical education. We can get the individualized instruction, service learning opportunities. And so there's those 15. Go ahead.
I was just going to add, Mark had shared the information from the National Dropout Prevention Center. There's also a National Technical Assistance Center on transition. When I was in high school, I did not know about NTACT. I wish I would have. NTACT has evidence-based practices, predictors, research-based practices, and predictors that align with some of those strategies that Mark was just talking about from the National Dropout Prevention Center. These evidence-based practices have been scientifically reviewed. They've been reviewed over and over and over, and they are causing changes within the students that are using some of these evidence-based practices. Why I would have liked to know about it as a teacher in the transition area, when I click into that area of transition planning, or if I'm looking graduation, post-school success, I can go onto their website and click that little plus sign. It takes me into a list of many different things that I can do. But one of the things I would have really appreciated is that they do have lesson plans that were created by other states and by other transition coordinators and transition teachers that they found to be effective with the students they use them with. I will tell you, when you go in, it kind of scared me at first. When you go in, you do have to register and you have to come up with a password. It's all free. The only reason that the National Center does that is to just track the amount of people that are using their system. So it's a good thing if you have to log in and use a password for that one.
Thanks, Leah. So this is just I guess, effectiveness of different strategies in supporting graduation improvement, reducing dropout. And if we think of correlations with a 1.0 being a perfect correlation, if we do this, then this will happen. Anything above a 0.7 is considered a really strong correlation to predicting outcomes. And that can go all the way down to 0. It can actually go into a -1. If we do this, then this is going to happen. In what we're doing right now, we want a 1.0 correlation. If we're trying to reduce behavior, it might be the more we do this, the less behavior. That'd be a negative correlation, which would be a good thing. But I share this just because the 2 top things on this as far as predicting graduation and reducing dropout rates are career development, job training. Those are pretty much transition related skills, aren't they? We know that students who take 2 consecutive CTE classes are in an area of high interest to them are almost guaranteed to graduate from high school. A 0.81 correlation, that is significant. We know that meaningful family engagement, not just having an open house once or twice a year, but meaningful family engagement supporting students in moving towards graduation. So all of these show effectiveness. These are just rank ordered.
Mark had talked earlier about community participation, and I just wanted to share, he's already mentioned the CTE on the career development and job training, but part of the community, part of the collaboration between agencies would to have the Division of Vocational Rehabilitation included. They had, through their new federal requirements of the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act a few years ago, they're required to provide services within high school to high school students. And some of the services they're required to provide are the PREATs, or the pre-employment job training type stuff. So they can either co-teach with a key teacher within the classroom. They can provide the instruction if the teacher wants to, or they can even just be a consultant for a teacher if they would like to use their materials to provide that instruction. But I think of that again as a high school teacher and thinking, how much easier would it have been if I would have been able to collaborate with an outside agency to assist in providing some of that training to those students?
So just as you're going to really start to get into the meat of transition planning, just continuing to invite and encourage teams to be thinking about that career development and the job training, to be thinking about the ABCs, the early warning systems, and family engagement. We know that self-advocacy and self-determination improvement, student-led IEPs can make a difference. How are we promoting resiliency in students? And just developing those meaningful relationships and partnerships with students, families, and all our partners. Thanks for the time, Leah.
Mark will be back, and Mark hopefully is going to be providing input as I go through the Indicator 13 requirements and writing the transition IEP. He's got to jump off for a little bit, but does anybody have any questions about the dropping out as a process and not an event, and how it related to some of the graduation stuff that he had talked about? What was the website you mentioned? You know, I was going to post it later, but I will post it right now. It's the NTACT. Do they call themselves the NTACT C right now? Because they've actually just received a new grant this year where they're now collaborating with, this is really funny, with the Division of Vocational Rehabilitation. So we have our national transition center that is collaborating with the National Voc Rehab Center. I think that gives us a great big message as to what works and what does not work. So I did post their link into the chat box. You should be able just to click on that, and that should get you to the NTACT C site. Any other questions, comments? If not, I'm going to go ahead and let Mark jump into his other meeting, and then he'll be back. And we're going to jump into the Indicator 13. Which, again, I'm going to go back to my years as a high school transition teacher. And every time I heard Indicator 13, I kind of cringed and I would sweat a little bit because I'd worry about, you know, where did I get wrong this year? What did I do wrong this year? As I started working with the state, I realized, you know, it's not really the state that's requiring this. This is the national level that requires us to write IEPs that are compliant, and their hope is if we're writing transition IEPs that are compliant, we're really enabling those students to graduate and to meet their post-secondary goals. The information that I have up here right now is the information that we have to provide to the national government through our annual performance report, or APR. This shows how many documents we reviewed. So we had 395 case managers, IEPs, that we reviewed this year. After giving the time, and I know as a transition teacher, you know that we monitor it in the summertime. We send them back in August, and then we ask for them to be back to us with corrections by the end of October, beginning of November. When that correction date came, we were able to complete and correct all 395 IEPs in all 8 of the requirement areas for Indicator 13. So when we report to OSEP this year, we're going to be reporting as a state 100% compliance rating for Indicator 13. This just shows the Indicator 13 data over time, again, after corrections are made. So North Dakota has consistently been in around the 97-98% range. This was what our data looked like prior to the corrections being conducted. So this is where I really thought, you know, let's get together, let's provide some more training so that when they're being written and services are being provided, maybe this preliminary number can go from 71% and increase a little bit. If we look at the percentage of responses, our lowest category in the state was having appropriate transition assessment included in our IEPs. As I go through this discussion, one of the most important pieces, if not the most important pieces, is that transition assessment piece, because that's going to show us who that student is and what that student might need. When we go back to what Mark was talking about, it might tie into some of those attendance or some of the behaviors that we're looking at. Some of the information we get from the transition assessment might help us to address some of the stuff that shows that a student might be straying off of that path to graduation. And then the second area that we were the lowest on as a state was actually inviting the student to the IEP. And I know as a transition teacher, you know, I had almost all the time I had my student at that IEP. And I would argue, you know, the student's at the IEP, he was obviously invited because he's sitting there at his own meeting. Why did I get marked incompliant in that area? And the federal government mandates that it has to be an invitation in writing of some sort that was given to the student prior to the date the IEP took place. So that's part of the reason I think that we're a little bit lower in that area. Now, if we look at the areas that we were probably the highest in, we did very well with writing annual goals that tie into the transition service needs. So we tied goals into the IEP, which makes sense, that were related to what the student needed to do and how the student needed to move forward that year. If we look at the federal definitions again, we're going to see that transition is supposed to be many sets, coordinated sets of activities that are to be result oriented. So result oriented, it's going to get them somewhere after they're finished. That's where we're going to come in with some of those goals that we write in the transition IEP. It's going to improve the academic and functional achievement as they move from school to employment into adult education, adult services, or independent or community living. And all of it, as we know, with an IEP is based on the individual's needs. It takes into account a strong piece of the transition IEP is that we look at the child's strengths, preferences, and interests. Why do we do that? Because if we write a transition IEP, or if we set up a high school curriculum experience that's based upon the strengths, preferences, and interests, the child is going to do possibly better with the services that we're providing and with academic behavioral scores and with graduation post-school outcomes. So we really have to try to set everything up to what they like, what they're good at. In North Dakota, we follow the federal definition of what it means to have a transition IEP, and that is that beginning no later than the first IEP to be in effect by the student's 16th birthday, there has to be transition services. So if we have a student that's 15 and we know that over the next year that his IEP is in place, he's going to turn 16, we have to have a transition IEP written. And as I said earlier, some units, some districts, some students need a transition IEP before 16. There's nothing wrong with writing one at 14, 15, and possibly even earlier if you feel as a case manager that that has to happen. And I've already said that for OSEP, 100% of our IEPs have to have transition services included. This is how the US code identifies or defines indicator 13. And the only reason I put this on here is not to read it to you, but the blue areas are those 8 requirements that we're required to meet compliancy with for indicator 13. So we want to make sure that there's transition services that are written in correlation with their post-secondary goals. They're updated annually. There's course of study. There's annual goals written, the students invited, and any outside agency is invited to the IEP. We'll go more into detail with this as we move forward. The North Dakota Department of Public Instruction also has, and many unit directors, many unit coordinators have this document, but I was going to share it with teachers in case they don't have it. This one gives us some tips on how we can write compliant IEPs and how we can make sure that what we're including in the transition IEP is something that will help us be compliant when we're writing the IEPs. And I'm trying to talk and copy and paste at the same time, which is causing a little bit of difficulties. So I'm going to go ahead and paste that link in the chat. Also, I did include the NTACT, and now I did put this tips for compliance book. I would have actually, if we could have done this face to face, I would have printed it off and handed you all of these materials, but because of COVID and where we're at, that's how it is. Jamie says, I'm curious about why the age of transition IEPs changed from 14 to 16 many years ago. You know, I don't have an answer to that. Personally, I think 14-year-olds, you know, the more that we get them involved with transition, the better off they're going to be. Sometimes 16, when you start looking at some of those agency co-ops, or you start looking at that dropout statistic that Mark shared, sometimes the dropout begins even before the age of 16. So I don't have an answer for you. I just know that it has. I also know that I have sat in some discussions with other states, and they're contemplating whether or not 16 is too old and they should do it earlier. I'm sorry, that was not a very good answer for that. So now we're going to get into the 8 different requirements of indicator 13. When we go back to that score sheet, or when you guys receive your own little score sheet, we're going to break them apart, and I'm going to talk to you about things that maybe could be included in an IEP and in planning for a student that is transition age. The first one we look at is, are there appropriate measurable post-secondary goals that cover education or training, employment, and if appropriate, independent living? I put in that bold-faced blue. I like to ask myself, what will the student do after high school? It has to be something that can happen, that they're actually going to do after they graduate. In North Dakota, you have to have a measurable post-secondary goal in the area of education or training. We have to have a measurable post-secondary goal in the employment area. Independent living skills, it depends upon the student and whether or not we feel there has to be an independent living skills goal. If we have a high school student that is performing in the same arena as a lot of the other high school peers of his, and we don't really feel that there has to be an independent living skills goal written, we leave that area blank, because even if we put a dot or if we put an NA in there, the TINET system forces us to write a T3 activity to go with that, and then we also have to write an annual goal that should go with that. If you have a student that actually has a need for developing an independent living skills, like some of the stuff I have listed there in financial, transportation, maybe medical type stuff for independent living, then we would go ahead and write a goal, and the rest of the IEP would flow with that goal. What I have listed here are just examples of what education, training, employment might look like. I will say this year is the first year that OSEP is requiring us to look at competitively paid employment, where the student will work in an environment where other peers are getting paid, and he or she is going to be able to be receiving the same benefits, the same pay raises, all of the same benefits that that student that's not non-disabled would receive. So when we look at measurable post-secondary goals, if we're sitting at a monitoring team and the monitoring team is looking at an IEP, we always look as to whether or not it's measurable. Is it something that we can measure, that we can see happening after that student graduates from high school? What is the desired outcome, or what is the dream for that student? What do they want to do? What kind of major life activities should take place? And it's all based upon the strengths, preferences, interests, and age-appropriate transition assessments. This is why I said that transition assessments are probably the most important piece. It's going to help show us what the strengths that student has are, what the preferences are, what interests are, and then it helps to determine, you know, we have a lot of students that say, I want to do this when I graduate, and they really don't even know a lot about themselves. But if we look at that transition assessment, hopefully we can help them see that maybe they're really, really good in the realistic areas or the artistic areas, and that can help them develop a most measurable post-secondary goal that's aligned with who they are as a person. So what do we look for in measurable post-secondary goals? Is it measurable? Can I see that student graduating from high school and going on to a workplace for job training? Can I see the student going into an area of employment, maybe specific to haircutting or something like that? Is it something that I can actually go see that student doing after they graduate from high school? We have to answer, is it going to happen after a high school? If it's something that happens during the high school career, we mark it non-compliant when we're looking at indicator 13. How do we know if it happens after high school? We can write either after high school, after graduation. I do want to say, if we're working with students that are looking at their 18 to 21 year program and they're attending maybe a transition academy or an A-step program, that's still considered their high school program because they haven't graduated. If the student's graduated and they're going to attend A-step or they're going to attend an adult learning center, then that's after graduation. That one gets a little bit confusing to some people. We ask whether or not we've looked at those strengths, preferences, and interests that we've obtained from the age-appropriate transition assessment to help write those measurable post-secondary goals. I'm a very visual person, so for me, I really wanted something to show me how I could go ahead and write a measurable post-secondary goal. And that NTACT site that I had talked about had a beginning of some kind of formula started. I added a little bit more to this. So we need a measurable post-secondary goal that happens after high school. So I added the after high school, after graduation. It's in parentheses because it's not a needed part of the component for indicator 13 monitoring. It just makes it easier to know that, oh yeah, this is what he wants to do when he's done with us. It's not going to be something that he's going to do when he's with us. Who is that student? What will? If we put will on here, it makes it a little bit more measurable, because if we put words like plans to or wants to, dreams of, those are what the what OSEP considers ambiguous verbs. We can't ever really see that happening. If I plan to go to college, I could plan to go to college for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, and maybe it will never happen. But if I write it as will attend college, it's more measurable that I can say, yep, I'm going to go see if he's at college, and yep, that student's actually at college. So it's more of a measurable term. What's going to happen that student wants to do after school, and then the where and how can be included, doesn't necessarily have to be. It makes it a better measurable post-secondary goal if it is. So I tried to include a lot of examples through this whole presentation to help understand some of the misunderstanding or misconceptions that might be taking place. So if we look at Olivia, she wants to be a CNA, so that's typed wrong, but after graduation from high school, she's going to complete training to become a CNA, not CNA through classes offered by the nursing home in her community. When does it take place? Is it after high school? Yes. What is she going to do? And can I see her doing it? So with complete training, I can actually go there and I can see her getting the training to become a CNA. And then the where and the how would be the nursing home in her community here. So then her employment measurable post-secondary goal would be after completing the CNA training, she will work as a CNA in a nursing home. Are there any questions if I go back to requirement number 1? What about students that have more than one potential appropriate goal? Can both be listed? For instance, a student who wants to go to the military or college, you know, actually I have seen where both are listed because maybe it's a younger student and they're not quite sure what they want to do yet. Might go to the military to receive training, might go to college. You could list both. So if I were looking at Olivia and I was going to, after graduating from high school, Olivia will complete training through the military or college for whatever it is that she might want to receive training for. You can list them both. Are there any other questions for measurable post-secondary goals? So if we go on to the second requirement for indicator 13, it's that those measurable post-secondary goals that we wrote are updated each year. How do we know if they're updated each year? Because sometimes the student wants, he knows at the age of 16 what he wants to be, and he continues to want to do that through his senior year. There's other times where maybe a student is 16, she has an idea, she changes her idea at 17, changes her idea at 18, and then changes her idea when she graduates. So those are the easy ones. If the idea changes, I can automatically see that the measurable post-secondary goal also changes. But when the measurable post-secondary goal changes, that kind of is an indicator that the rest of the IEP should change so that we can help that student meet whatever that measurable post-secondary goal is. So if the measurable post-secondary goal changes, we're going to look at areas like the course of study. We're going to look at transition services. We're going to look at annual goals and make sure they still align to what it is the student will do after they graduate. If it's a student that has the same measurable post-secondary goal from year to year, some units have opted to put up in the measurable post-secondary goal area that it was reviewed by the team in whatever year you reviewed it. So the current year reviewed by the team in 2021 and stays the same. Other ways that I'll know whether or not it was updated, when I go into the transition assessment information, I can see that there was new transition assessments conducted with the information being provided in that present level page. I can see maybe that if there was an area that was mentioned on the transition assessment that needed a little bit of assistance to get the score up, I can see maybe that the scores have increased in a specific area on the transition assessment. So these are what I was just talking about. It's going to be different from the year before, or if not, it's going to have a date that says that we reviewed it as a team. It's going to show that there was a discussion about the students' measurable post-secondary goals. That might be in the present level where they go in and they review the measurable post-secondary goal and the student agrees that he still wants to be a mechanic. And if it's the students, if it's a 16-year-old transition IEP and it's the very first time that we wrote a transition IEP, this one automatically becomes marked incompliant. What did you say about team reviewing goals when they have the same goal every year? Yep, when they have the same goal every year, if you would just either in the present level say, you know, the team discussed the idea that Mark wants to go on and be a teacher in a high school setting. Mark continues to believe that this is the goal he wants to obtain after he graduates from high school. You could write that in the present level, or where you write the measurable post-secondary goal. If we go back to that Olivia goal, after graduation from high school, Olivia, we can just put in parentheses behind this that the goal was reviewed in October of 2020. And then again, next year reviewed in October of 2021, if she never changes her idea about becoming a CNA. Are there any other questions on the measurable post-secondary goals? I am going to give you a link in the chat right now. I created a one-pager because that other document I gave you, I don't remember how many pages that Tips for Compliance has. This one pager will include the formula for the goals, and I believe on that one I have some sample goals for you guys to look at too. So that one is now in the chat, and we're going to move on to requirement number 3 for indicator 13. Again, I do believe that this is probably the most important requirement. Why it's listed as 3 and not 1, I don't understand, because everything that is obtained from the age appropriate transition assessment should drive the rest of the IEP. So if we look at the Code of Federal Regulations again, it says that an IEP should include appropriate measurable post-secondary goals that are annually updated. I highlighted annually updated because you're not going to know where the growth has happened in that kid or which direction we're going to take that student if we don't look at this information from year to year with the student. And I know as a teacher, sometimes I thought, oh, I don't have the time. We have homework to do. We have goals to meet. I don't have the time to conduct another transition assessment. But it really does provide very important information that assists in helping them to graduate and be successful after they do graduate. There's a question that says, do I suggest specific transition assessment that covers every area and breaks down areas into more detailed information? You really should have, if we look at this one, we should have transition assessment information in every area. If for some reason you want to give one individual assessment for the jobs and job skill area, you can. If you want to give a different one for recreation, you can. There's many transition assessments out there that include all of those areas that we can use. So if it's the same transition assessment for all areas, that's fine too. The important part is that it's updated every year, or at least, you know, resubmitted every year. And then we look and say, last year in the realistic portion of, and I'm just pulling this, of this certain transition assessment, the student obtained 40%. This year in the realistic part of the transition assessment, he is obtaining 60%. So you can see that growth happening. That kind of stuff also keeps us out of any kind of due process hearings that we might be involved in. It shows any attorney that might review the student's IEP that there was appropriate things put in place, that the student is making gains, that the student is working towards that measurable post-secondary goal. So when we write our transition assessments, again, we're looking at strengths, preferences, interests, and I did list needs on here because some of the goals that we write, the annual goals, might be written to address the needs that we find in appropriate transition assessment. Maybe our transition assessment is telling us that the student needs budgeting skills development. So maybe when we write our annual goal, we can write in a budgeting goal. They have to tie back again to those measurable post-secondary goals of education, employment, and independent living. Why do we do this? We want to help the students identify what they're good at. We want to help the students identify what they might decide to do in high school, and also how it might tie into their plan for post-secondary goals and adult living. I put a couple bullets on here from the Division of Career and Technical Institute that talks about how assessment is the common thread in tying it all together. It's the basis for defining goals and other services that are going to be included in the individualized education program. So again, this is the most important part of the IEP. When we look at transition assessment, I think we all know that it can be formal and informal. We can use either or when we're conducting and collecting information related to the student's strengths, preferences. They can be through observations, through interviews. I did list some of the different assessments that can be used or that I've seen used on some of the IEPs in North Dakota. If we look at the self-determination assessment, there is a new Transition North Dakota app. It's been out, I believe, now for maybe 2 years. It was created by the Protection and Advocacy Project. And it's an app that you either download on a computer in the classroom or you can download it on a cell phone, and the student completes the app. That gives them a lot of transition information that can be included in the age appropriate transition assessment. I did not include this with my list, but if you look at Transition North Dakota app, and I believe it is in one of the documents I'm going to share with you, you would be able to get that. There's different transition planning inventories. There's different curriculum-based assessments that we can use. We want to look at things like the interviews when we're looking at parents or students, or maybe the parents are even going to complete a parent form. That can help come up with maybe what the student is interested in for a career. It can tell us how the student studies in the home environment, maybe how the student is spending his or her money at home. Tells us what they like to do in their spare time, who their friends and relationships are. Maybe if the student is a student that doesn't have a driver's license, it gives us information of how that student gets around town. Are they just relying on the parent, or are they using a bicycle? If it's in a larger city, do they know how to use the bus system? Are they participating in any community events or volunteer activities that maybe we wouldn't know about within the school? How do they manage their time at home? We can see how they manage their time at school, but it might be beneficial to compare the two environments. And then how do they use technology at home? I did have a comment that ONET is being used and love it. I hear that from a lot of people, not only at the state, but also at the national level. This is part of what come out of the NTACT collaborative and the NTACT work with vocational rehabilitation. The more that we can collaborate either with outside agencies or with other teachers, the better we're going to be able to paint a picture of who this kid is through assessment. If we invite or involve families and students, that's going to help us to figure out who this student is, and it's going to help us to develop an IEP that helps that student to graduate. If you go back to one of those 15 predictors of success that Mark had talked, I believe the second one on the list was that meaningful family engagement. So if we can include families, let's do it. I included outside agencies on this one again because I had talked a little bit in Mark's presentation about how Voc Rehab can assist in providing the pre-ETS training. The more I get to work with Voc Rehab and the more I get to know what their requirements are at the federal level, the more I understand why it's important to work with them. Voc Rehab, when they look at a student and they determine whether or not they're eligible for services, they have some specific assessment tools that they have to conduct with that student. So if we can talk to we have a student that's involved with Voc Rehab and they have are looking at conducting an assessment, we can ask Voc Rehab to share the assessment results with us, or maybe we're conducting an assessment and instead of testing that kid, we can share our information with Voc Rehab to make it easier on their end. But I would really suggest, visiting with them and asking them, what kind of information are you going to collect? What kind of assessment are you going to conduct? And include that on your list of transition assessments and in the present level of performance, explaining what it is that that student is good at through the Voc Rehab eyes. I really like this chart that I had gotten from the University of Kansas a few years back because it puts that age-appropriate transition assessment at the very top of what needs to be done when we're looking at a student who is transition age. If we conduct the transition age-appropriate assessments, it gives us so much information to help us drive and help us write, first of all, that T1 post-secondary goal. And then after we write the T1 and we have the age-appropriate assessment, we can then develop the rest of the IEP. Then we worry about transition services. Then we worry about course of study, annual goals. We look at who might assist that student in reaching their annual goals. We look at community experiences, course of study, some of the stuff that Mark had talked about for successful graduation. But it all starts with age-appropriate transition assessment. So this is just a picture of what our form looks like. And I put this on here because I really wanted to show you, you know, this is all up on the top, the regular present levels that we have on all of our IEPs. And then when we get down to the bottom as a transition teacher, we know that this is where our transition information goes. It's the transition information that then is going to go up and drive the measurable post-secondary goals. Questions that we look at if we're writing an IEP that would meet compliance for the transition assessment requirement and for assisting that student in moving forward. Do we have the names of the assessment tools listed? If I used the Enderly or if I used ONET, do I have that listed as an assessment tool that was used to conduct the assessment? Do I summarize the results that I might have gotten from those assessment tools? I see a lot of the times assessment tools listed on IEPs, but I don't see a lot of information collected from that assessment tool. And I think it just makes the IEP stronger, and it also makes the students' programming a little bit stronger if we're able to use the information that we get right from that assessment. Do the students' measurable post-secondary goals align with that age-appropriate transition assessment information that we have obtained? Do we have a summary of the transition in the present level, and do we update, and are they age appropriate? OSEP really states that the assessment should be age appropriate, chronologically age appropriate when we're conducting them with students. I wanted to share, you know, a few years back when I first started working, we heard a lot of court cases that centered around maybe some of the early childhood or elementary age students. But since I've been working here and as I'm visiting more and more with other states and with lawyers across the nation, they're telling me that there's coming to be more litigation related to the transition areas in the high schools. So when we're writing these, I really am, you know, presenting today to help you make benefits to the student, but also to write an IEP that is going to keep you out of trouble when it comes time to possibly go into litigation due to a complaint or a due process hearing. On this one, this was one, when you use the formal and informal, you cannot only use, there was a blue highlight on that formal and informal, you cannot only use student interview, parent interview, and observation. That's not enough. You have got to use some kind of assessment tool when you're assessing the student. When we go back to this court case of Gibson versus Forest Hills, the district, Forest Hills, used only observation data. They didn't accurately obtain information related to the student's transition needs by using any other tools. So when the attorney looked at this case, they stated that the school failed to develop an appropriate transition plan, which resulted in a loss of meaningful educational opportunity for the student, which became a violation of FAPE. A violation of FAPE are a lot of what we're going to see when we're looking at liturgical stuff. Only utilizing, the attorney went on to say, only utilizing observations offered little insight into the student's preferences and interests. The district said that they denied the student FAPE by failing to adequately plan for her post-secondary future. Because they did not use these transition assessments, the attorney and the courts ruled that you didn't even plan for her future to enable her to be successful after she exits your system. So then the court ordered an award to the parents for $327,641 in attorney fees that the school had to pay to the parents. So it's pretty serious stuff. I wanted to include, because I get a lot of calls about, oh my gosh, what do I do? How do I use assessment? How can I do this 4 or 5 years in a row? We do have an age-appropriate transition assessment toolkit that was finished by NTACT. This one has a lot of information on how to use the transition assessment information to drive an IEP, but it also has specific transition assessments that you can use when you're writing an IEP. North Dakota has a transition assessment matrix. It is not on our website right now because it's not accessible. When we got our new website a year ago. We have to have everything accessible in order to place it on the website. This is a big document where you can choose whether or not you want to look at a transition assessment tool related to a 9th grader, to maybe an 18-year-old in the area of maybe independent living or job skills. And you click on it and then it takes you to the tool and it'll tell you how much the tool costs or whether or not it's free. If it's free, it'll take you to the website where you can access the free document. Because it's not on the website, I just ask that you guys either call me or you email me, and then I will upload the transition assessment matrix and send it back to you via an email. Another one that I really like is Tennessee has done a lot of work with their transition. They have an online assessment database that's very similar to the transition assessment matrix that we have in North Dakota. Theirs isn't quite as big, but again, you can click on whether or not I want a student that is 17. I think it has ages on it, but then I can also click what is the student's disability, what is the area that I want to assess, and when I click on it, it takes me to that transition assessment tool that I can possibly use for that student. So I put the link for both the NTACT toolkit and the transition assessment database into the chat. You should be able to click on them. You should be able to access them directly from there. Are there any questions in the area of transition assessment? I'm going to show you an example of, this is really big. I'm used to working at home on a little tiny screen and I'm in the office with really big screens today. I'm going to show you an example of just a part of the present level, the transition assessment information. So if we look at up on the top, education training, those are Matt's measurable post-secondary goals. After graduation from high school, he's going to attend a 2-year university to obtain an entry-level welding certificate. After he gets his welding certificate, he's going to be employed in his uncle's welding shop. So what did we use to assess? We did a differential aptitude test on the bottom. So I listed the name of the assessment. I listed a date that it was conducted. We used a career planning survey. We used a work adjustment inventory. We did a student interview, and I also collected input by his CTE welding instructor. What was all of the information, or what's the summary of that information? So if I look up in the paragraph that was written, I can see what I had gotten from the individual tests that I had conducted and how it might tie into what Matt's measurable post-secondary goals were. Matt performed in the high average range on the differential aptitude test. In the mechanical comprehension and spatial reasoning. So when I look at mechanical comprehension, he wants to be a welder. Does it tie into mechanics? Definitely. He has strengths in the area of mechanical work. He's a dedicated employee according to the work adjustment inventory. I think he'll do well as a welder. And then when I conducted an informal interview and just asked Matt, he said that he's already been working part-time in his uncle's metal shop. He's interested in welding as a career, so that also ties into that measurable post-secondary goal. He's currently enrolled in a Welding Technology 1 course through the NDCTE, and he's going to be participating in another work-based learning experience that's different from the one that he participated with his uncle over the summertime. So that just shows you how you can align the assessment with the measurable post-secondary goal. Questions, comments? Here's another one. This one I wrote, I wrote it for Monique's independent living. So Monique would have had an independent living goal. I did not include it, so I'm sorry about that. But we had, again, how did we obtain it? There's a name of the assessment tools that were used. We have the community planning worksheet. We have the date that it was given. We have a student interview and a parent interview, and we also did an observation in foods class. Monique is pretty young, so this was her first transition IEP. It was conducted in the 1920 school year. What did we find out? We found out that she's able to identify her healthcare providers. She's able to inform her parents when she needs appointments. And when I'm looking at that, she's able to inform her parents when she needs appointments. At the age she is now, it's appropriate, but as she grows older, I think it should become her responsibility to set up those appointments. So maybe that could be an area that I could look at including for an annual goal or a transition service as I'm writing the rest of the IEP. She is good at asking for help. She's able to identify activities that she likes to do outside of school, what she likes to do when she becomes an adult. She has age appropriate social skills, has healthy relationships. She has her driver's permit, but taking the written test was difficult for her. So maybe I have to look at incorporating test taking. And I'm sure, you know, through her elementary years, we've already identified that test taking is difficult for her. She had to take her permit test 4 times. She was using the online training manual, took practice tests to assist in getting the permit, but she was able to get it. She's going to take her driving test later this year. What else does she like? Monique likes making meals for her family. I'm going to go ahead and make sure everybody's muted quick. She likes making meals for her family. She's using cooking apps to find different recipes. But she does have a hard time locating measuring spoons and cups for the ingredient list. She still doesn't know how to tell the difference between the half cup, third cup. Is it a tablespoon? Is it a teaspoon? So there again, I could possibly write that into her transition IEP somewhere to help her make gains in that area. So if there are not any other questions with transition assessment, I think I'm going to go ahead and move on to requirement number 4. Before I do that, I'm looking at I do have a link again for an assessment 1-pager. That was very similar to the measurable post-secondary goal 1-pager. So I'm going to go ahead and put the assessment 1-pager in there. So the 4th requirement is transition services, or what we know as a T3 activities. If we look at Code of Federal Regulations again from the federal government, it's a set of coordinated activities. They're designed to be results orientated, so they're working together to get the student to an outcome phase, focused on improving academic and maybe functional achievement of a child to move from school to post-school activities. Whenever we have a post-secondary goal, measurable post-secondary goal in the areas of education and employment and possibly independent living, we should have an annual goal that ties into those measurable post-secondary goals. It should be in the area of instruction related services, community experiences, development of an employment and post-school objectives, daily living if appropriate, and functional vocational evaluation if appropriate. Things that we list on the T3 chart should be things that are different from what all graduating seniors or all freshmen, sophomore, juniors are receiving in the high school. It has to be stuff that are individualized for the student. So when I see on the T3 page, will complete the ACT or will pass classes, that's a general statement for all students. That does not meet compliance if we put something in there that all students are required to do. The transition services are going to tell us what needs to happen, who provides the services, or who assists with the activity so that the student can move more towards completing that measurable post-secondary goal or that T1 activity. Where do we get ideas for T3? Again, we look at that transition assessment. We look at the student's performance in the school at that time. That helps determine what kind of T3 activities we should write into that IEP for that school year. There should be a timeline when we're looking at writing these. One thing about the timeline, if we're talking about a school year timeline, it might be different than an IEP year timeline. Some IEPs are held in September or May. They would follow the school year timeline. The ones that are held like this time of the year, January, we would have to be a little more specific on our timeline for transition services that aligns with the IEP and not the school year. So if we have an IEP that was written today, January 13th, my timeline might say January of 2021 to January of 2022, or January 13th of 2021 to January 12th of 2022. I do have an example to show that. So here's an example of Lisa, her education and training goal. She's going to attend a four-year university to become an elementary education teacher. Her employment goal says after she completes college and gets her teaching license, she's going to teach in an elementary school. And then Lisa did have a need for an independent living goal area. She needs to set up her own medical appointments. So we wrote after graduation from high school, she's going to learn how to, or she will set up her own medical appointments. What are some transition service activities that tie into her going to a post-secondary institution? So one thing we can do is maybe visit a college office or disability services office. And you can see on the timeline here, we don't think that it's going to take the entire year for her to visit the college disability services office. Mom and dad said that they were willing to take her in March or April of 2020. Where does it take, or what areas is it going to affect? It'll affect instruction, adult living. These were those requirements set forth by the Code of Federal Regulations that we have to have at least one of these checked. When we wrote the TINET, or we completed the TINET for T3, we included it as a checklist because we just thought it would be easier than trying to list whichever area might be pertinent. What are some other things that Lisa's going to have when she attends a four-year university? She's got to learn a little bit more about self-advocacy. So we're going to give her some self-advocacy training. Who's going to be responsible or who's going to assist? The case manager. We're going to carry it into the general education classrooms. We're going to have the counselor do some of the self-advocacy training. And then we're going to have the student obviously be involved with the training. This one is going to be a whole year. And this is what I had talked about with the transition IEP compared to the school year. This IEP took place on October 10th of 2020. So it's going to start October 10th of 2020 and go through October 9th of 2021. Then it aligns with the whole transition IEP. If it doesn't align with that, the questions we get at the federal level are, well, why did the transition services stop in May? If it's aligned with that school year, why did it stop in May when the IEP is actually going to carry over to the next school year? Why didn't you carry the transition services into the next school year? This is a way to fix that part of it. How are we going to provide activities that align with her going to teach in an elementary school? We want her to job shadow 3 elementary schools. Teachers, who's going to be responsible? The school counselor, the elementary schools in the area, the student, and we're going to use it over the IEP timeline, October 10th through October 9th. And then for her setting up her own medical appointments, what are we going to do? We're going to have her research medical providers in the town that she wants to attend college, because that's the first time she's going to come into an area where she's possibly going to have to do it on her own without having parents present. So we're going to do research with the special education teacher and the student from October to February. Then after February, beginning in March, we're going to start some mock telephone calls where we can try to set up appointments with Lisa. And that's going to again be between the case manager and the student. And you can see all of the different areas that each one of those T3 activities would tie into with the check marks. These are just some examples of T3 activities we might want to list in there. Under instruction, we have all of those. Under community experiences, employment, related services, adult living, post-school, and daily living. Does anybody have any questions on the T3 part of it? I'm going to go ahead and put another document in the chat. This is what the cover of the document looks like. It's been updated. It has lists and lists of T3 activities that you might want to use for employment, for training education, for independent living skills. You just go through it. It's not a list that ends by any means. There's a whole bunch of other activities that might be included in there that you can come up with on your own, but it gives you an idea of some things that maybe we want to include in there. I talked about some of the pre-ets. Maybe some of the activities that Voc Rehab is doing could be included as a T3 activity, or maybe even an annual goal in an IEP.
Leah, this
Yep.
this is Mark, and I'm back. I appreciate what you're saying, and I just keep getting struck with, you know, sometimes we talk about the 3 R's in graduation or dropout prevention, that relevance, relationships, and rigor, and that's so much of what you're talking about right now, isn't it? I mean, what is specifically exactly relevant to where the student is and what they need to move forward, to support them moving forward. It needs to be rigorous, not so hard that it's frustrating, but not so easy that it's not worth their time. And then the relationships, for the most part, I mean, we all need to work together to support the student coming back to graduating choice ready there again. It's relevant, it's relationships, and it's rigorous.
Yep, good point. Can all of this be sent to us through an email so we can print off what we need? I'm going to see if I can get a meeting attendant list that might have emails on it. Mark, do you know how to do that?
I can do a little research if you want to.
The only thing, because this was created as a Teams meeting and it was open for anybody to join, I don't have individual emails, so I'm going to get inundated with emails, and I understand that. But if for some reason I can't find a list of emails through the Teams site, don't hesitate to send me an email, because I have all of this already saved onto one-page document that I could easily copy into an email. So just send me an individual email and I'll make sure that you get all of this stuff back to you. So if we look at transition services, or T3, they're specific and individualized. It's not the same thing that everybody else receives. What is unique for this student that must be addressed to help him or her reach their measurable post-secondary goals and result in him or her achieving those goals? Are we linking anything to any outside agencies? If so, we could put them in that box that says who's responsible to provide services. The only thing, remember, if we put them in the box on the T3 activity page, we also have to invite them to the IEP meeting. If we're going to invite them to the IEP meeting, we have to have that consent form signed from the parents that it's okay to invite outside agency representatives. But again, you know, if we go back to the evidence-based predictors of success, inviting or linking adult agencies together to provide services with students is one of the better predictors. And then on the bottom, I just had put sharing progress, because I work a lot with the transition community of practice, and I visit a lot with parents who have students with special needs that are transition age. And they say, you know, it's nice that we see those transition services on the IEP. It would be nice if we could see if they've worked towards completing them or where their progress is with completing them. So if I go back to that one where I had right here, Lisa, where she was going to job shadow 3 elementary teachers, maybe I could just put on the bottom of a progress report, even though they tied to annual goals and not transition services, just put a little comment that Lisa has visited 1 elementary teacher in the area, just so parents have an idea of how they're working towards the transition services. Not a requirement, just one of those things that might build those relationships and might enable the family engagement a little bit more. So before I go on to number 5, Mark, did you have something to add?
Nope, I'm sorry.
No. Okay. Before I go on to number 5, I know Mark left us for a little while and he just joined us, but I think I'm going to go ahead and let everybody have about a 10-minute break. Just get up and move a little bit. If you have any questions, can think of any questions, bring them back, ask us. And I am looking at the time and I know that if we continue like we are, I just hope I'm not moving too quickly. But if we continue going like we are, we should definitely be done by 4:30. So with that, let's take a 10-minute break. Be back here at 2:50 Central Time. All right, I think we're going to get ahead or go ahead and get started on the second half, which really is not going to be a half because it's going much quicker than I thought. The face-to-face training that I provided a few years ago did take 6 hours, but we did a lot of hands-on activities that we're just not able to do virtually. So I was going to just let you know that I did have a 1-pager for the transition services activities. I did upload that. It's called the T.31 pager. And then I also included my email address in the chat box. I do have it included later on in the PowerPoint, but I thought if anybody wanted to use it now, or if they wanted to copy paste it into their email stuff now, they sure could. If they wanted to send me an email asking for all of the documents, they sure could. I just don't know. I was able to download the participant list. I don't know if all of the emails will be included on that participant list. If they are, then I will go ahead and email all of you the documents. If not, at least, you know, if you send me an email, I'll have your email and I'll make sure you get it. So far in the discussion that we've had this afternoon, we've talked about graduation. We've talked about how dropping out is not a one-time event. It's actually a process that takes place after over many years. We also addressed a question about transition age of 14 compared to 16 and how sometimes that process of dropping out starts before the student is even 16 years old and has a transition IEP. That should be considered through the school system to help determine which avenues we take if we start seeing some of those red flags pop up. We've talked about the first requirement of having measurable post-secondary goals, the second requirement having those goals updated annually, the third requirement having age-appropriate transition assessment. And again, I'm going to get my little spiel in here about how transition assessment is the most important part of the transition IEP that drives all other parts of the IEP. It drives the process to determine whether or not the student is on a good path towards graduation and on a good path towards being productive at post-school. And then we've also talked about requirement number 4, the requirement that there are transition services in the IEP that link back to the transition assessment and the measurable post-secondary goals. So then the 5th one is the course of study, or what we call the T2 page in North Dakota. The key about the course of study is it reasonably set up to enable the student to meet his or her measurable post-secondary goal. Again, the course of study should be individualized for the student. We should look at the transition assessment. We should look at the measurable post-secondary goals. We might want to look at some of those early warning signs that Mark had talked about this morning as we're developing this course of study for the student. When we're looking at course of study, we want to make sure that we have all anticipated coursework for the high school years identified as thoroughly as we possibly can, knowing that they might change as the student grows from year to year. So what our course of study looks like our freshman year is probably not what our course of study is going to look like when the student becomes a junior or even a senior. We should have elective courses entered in there. Those elective courses should go back to what the measurable post-secondary goals are, or maybe some of the strengths and preferences that we had found in the transition assessment. We should have the number of credits that the student is going to earn listed in there. We should have the number of credits that the student has earned for each year that they've completed school. So if the student is a junior, we should have the number of credits listed for his freshman year and for his sophomore year. If the student is a freshman, there won't be any credits listed in that credits to be earned column yet. And I know that there's a lot of, if the IEP is held halfway through the school year, they're entering credits for a semester. That makes it a little more confusing. It really is better to add the credits after the student has finished a year in school. So if you're writing a transition IEP in the middle of the year, like right now, and the student is a sophomore, the only credits that you're going to enter that have been earned are for his freshman year in school. We have to make sure that the number of courses that are entered match the number of courses or are going to add up to the number of courses required for graduation, and that they also add up to the number of courses that are needed to graduate. The 4 Englishes, the 3 maths, the 3 sciences, 3 social studies, physical education, and then the additional units of credit. And one other thing I like to think about with the course of study is that it stands up to a stranger test. And what I mean by that, if I have a student that's in my school right now, but moves in the middle of the year to a different school, is that other school going to be able to look at the course of study to learn what courses the student has completed, to learn what courses the student is currently taking, to learn what courses the student will be taking, and will they be able to use that course of study to now get the student into their system to provide the same types of credits to the student? So this is just kind of a summary of what I just talked about. If we have a student that might have failed part of a class that's required, a core class, or maybe the entire class, our course of study in his IEP should look at credit recovery. I, as an outside person, as a stranger doing that stranger test, should be able to look at the course of study and see where that credit recovery came into play at, when the student was able to get the credits that maybe he or she did not receive through failure, through attendance not being there. When we're completing an IEP in the area of course of study, we want to ask ourselves, do we have the coursework for the entire high school years identified in the course of study? Do the number of credits add up to or exceed the number required for graduation? Many times in our monitoring team, if we have to mark this one out of compliance, it really is for that statement right there. The number of credits does not earn up to what should be needed for graduation. So if there's 22 credits that the district requires for graduation, if I go into that column that says credits to be earned and I add those columns together, it should add up to whatever that district is asking or mandating for graduation requirements. Does it tie into the measurable post-secondary goals? And does the course of study allow the student to meet his most measurable post-secondary goals? If I go back to Matt, who wanted to be a welder in his uncle's shop, his course of study might have some courses in it that relate to shop work or to welding, to mechanics type program. One thing I really like to state on this one, if I have a student whose measurable post-secondary goal is to go into college, so maybe I have a student, I don't remember the one that wanted to go in to be a teacher, but she was going to attend the 4-year university. But I've given her maybe an applied English course, applied math course for all 4 years of high school. That's not going to enable her to meet her measurable post-secondary goals, because a student cannot get into a college with with applied topics courses, unless it's a student that maybe is looking at a program like A-STEP. So you really have to think when that student's young, and if we think as an IEP team, or we think as a teacher, an applied topics course or applied English course might be better for that student, we really have to ask, how is it going to affect the student's future? And if it's going to affect negatively the measurable post-secondary goals, we have to think of something different as a team, a way to enable that student to move forward so that they can possibly reach those measurable post-secondary goals. We don't want to set them up for failure early on. This is an example of a completed course of study for a student who is currently in 11th grade. And obviously the dates are a little behind, but as a freshman, you can see all of the courses that he was taking. I put in parentheses behind it, not necessary, but it just helps to add up the credits, how many credits he's going to earn. So in physical science, it was 1 credit. Computer applications, a half a credit. Ag mechanics was a half a credit. Total credits to be earned were 6 that year. He was able to earn 5.5. So as somebody coming in from the outside, I say, uh-oh, what happened to the other half a credit? But then when I look at his sophomore year, I can see that English 9 he failed the second semester. He had to take the second semester over. So the credit recovery course was an English 9 and he was able to earn a half credit. And then the other courses that he was going to take as a sophomore, how many credits was he going to earn? 6. How many had he earned? 6. TINAT automatically computes the total columns earned. So as soon as I put credits earned, TINAT automatically does this column with the credits earned. If I look for this student, I don't have it included, but there's that little part on the TINAT or on the TINAT form that says how many credits are required for graduation. This school requires 22 credits. So then I look and I take 11.5 and I'll add the 12 remaining that he's going to earn, and I can see that he's got 23.5 credits. If they require 22, this student is online to graduate. That's the part sometimes I add them up and I get maybe 21.5 or maybe 20 when the school is requiring 22 credits. We have to mark it out of compliance because that might be one of the students that are on the path to dropping out. We don't know. If an attorney were to come in and look at it through, again, a due process complaint or some other dispute type thing, they might wonder, why are we not addressing the credits and why is the student not going to have enough credits to graduate? Is the student even going to graduate? Do we have a plan that's appropriate for that student? Are there any questions on the course of study? If a student is able to take a credit recovery over the summer, then I would put it into the next year and you could list it. So let's pretend that this student actually took this English 9 credit recovery the summer between his sophomore or freshman and sophomore year. I could just go at English 9 credit recovery over the summer of 2017 and list it on there. So just identify in here the summer that it would have been completed, and that would be fine. Good question. Any other questions with course of study? These last 3 requirements are really quite short ones. I do have a course of study 1-pager that I'm going to put into the chat right now. There you go. So then the 6th requirement for indicator 13 are the annual IEP goals. This one, sometimes when I sit in on the national meetings, what's the difference between the number 1 and number 6? Number 6, annual, yearly, it's conducted over a 1-year time span, and it's something that we work on for a year time span that helps the student move forward towards meeting the number 1 or the measurable post-secondary goal. Again, if you look at the definition for each measurable post-secondary goal, so for the education, training, and the employment and life or independent living, if necessary, there should be an annual goal that ties into it. It should relate to the student's transition service needs, which also relate to the transition assessment needs. So it's all one revolving document that's working together. I will say that sometimes you might have one annual goal that ties into the employment, training, and independent living all together. So when we look at measurable post-secondary goals, we ask ourselves, is this going to support the transition needs and the transition plan that I have in place for the student so that they can work towards meeting their measurable post-secondary goals to become what they want to become when they graduate? Do they address individual needs or specially designed instruction? They should not, again, be something that everybody is receiving in that school. It should be something specific to that student. That's why a student is a student with special needs, because they're needing that specially designed instruction. Do they state what the student will learn within the next year? 1-year time span. Does it have a baseline and ending level criteria? When I look at some of the court cases, this is one thing that some of the attorneys and the judges will look at to determine whether or not there is progress being made from the student. And it's hard to tell if there's being progress made if there's not baseline data listed in the goal. Here's an example of a goal for Sean. Sean has a learning disability. So after graduation, this is his measurable post-secondary goal. This is his T1 activity. After he graduates from high school, he wants to complete coursework for diesel mechanics in the military or at a VOTEC college. So that kind of goes back to the question that was asked earlier. He's not quite sure if he's going to go to the military yet, but he knows he wants to go for diesel mechanics. What kind of annual goal can I write that ties into him wanting to be a diesel mechanic at a VOTEC college or military? Sean is, like I said, a student with a learning disability in the area of reading comprehension. So we wrote an annual IEP goal that ties into the academic area. If you can write an IEP goal that ties into the coursework for diesel mechanics, go ahead and do it. If you feel that an academic goal would be appropriate to write to meet the transition needs, you can do that too. If there's a behavioral goal that might be pertinent in order for that student to move forward to meet the measurable post-secondary goal, there can be an annual goal for behavior too. So what is Sean's annual IEP goal? We're going to give him direct instruction. We're going to provide him with a work of fiction, and we're going to provide him learning strategies on reading comprehension. How are we going to know if he's making progress? He's going to use reading comprehension strategies 8 out of 10 assignments and achieve 75% accuracy on the comprehension portion of the assignment. He was at 60%. So now if I look at this and I look at progress reports, I can determine whether or not Sean is working in that correct line of achievement to meet that goal, which will help him to become a good military or college student in order to work towards achieving his diesel mechanics degree. Here's another one for Lily. Lily, I believe, had multiple disabilities. So after high school, we're going to give supports from a job coach. There's going to be a job coach involved that's going to help her obtain a part-time competitive integrated employment position in a coffee shop or a restaurant. That's what she's going to do when she graduates from high school. How are we going to get her there through an annual goal? We're going to teach her how to use her head switch, which she has just gotten over the last year for communication. So we're also working on some self-advocacy goals, which Mark talked about earlier, that leads more towards a successful graduation. She's going to learn how to use her head switch and independently participate or respond in the classroom and community activities. Lily is also out in the community working part-time with a job coach right now. So she's going to use that head switch when she's working with her job coach too. And she's going to move from the 40% accuracy rating to an 80% accuracy rating. So as we're looking at the teacher rubrics that are going to measure them, we can see whether or not she's making improvements from 40% to 80% with using her head switch. I did include also an independent living goal. Connor has a hearing impairment. What he wants to do when he graduates, after graduation, he's going to self-advocate for accommodations in college. So he's going to go to college, but he's got to learn how to ask for accommodations and how to self-advocate his needs so that the college disability service area can determine what appropriate accommodations might be for him. How is he going to get there? Through a 1-year program. We're going to role play with Connor, and we're going to help him determine his legal rights and how to advocate for his needs. 4 out of 5 trials across 3 consecutive weeks. We've tried it with him. The baseline that we collected, he was able to do it 1 time out of 5 across the 3 consecutive week time. Any questions on annual goals? I do have an annual goal 1-pager that I'm going to put into the chat. We're going to move on to, was the student invited to his or her IEP meeting where the transition services were discussed? The best person to advocate for themselves at an IEP team meeting and help determine which kind of strategies might work best for them is the student himself. If we go back again to some of those evidence-based predictors, self-advocacy was a top one. Student lead IEPs was a top one. So if we can get the student there and participate, we're already increasing the rate of possibly staying on that track to graduate. When we're looking at the student of meeting, we have to see that again, in writing, that the student was invited to the IEP meeting. In TINET, we have created 2 different forms to invite a student to a meeting. One of them is the student notice of meeting form, and the other one is the notice of meeting form. When you use the student notice of meeting form, it automatically puts the student as the person that's receiving the notice of meeting. So that one automatically puts us in compliance for inviting that student. If we use the notice of meeting form, it's got that box that says to, and many times we list the guardians, the parents. That also has to have the student's name if we're using that notice of meeting form. Then it would be marked compliant because he is listed in the person that is going to be receiving the invite. And I will say there's also units or districts that opt to create their own student invitation form. These are appropriate too and can be marked in compliance as long as they're uploaded into TINET and we can see them. And that they're actually written for or to the student, then we will mark it in compliance. When I talked earlier about IEPs that were marked out of compliance for this, we had noticed on the date form that maybe it was written the day of the IEP meeting, which means that there was really not much time to be previously notified of the IEP coming up. Or we had noticed when we looked at when the document was created, it was actually created after the IEP meeting. And I think, again, I'm a big due process person. I think, again, about the due process in an attorney. And if they were going to look at that creation date, I really think they would question us and say, well, how could the student have had a written copy in his hands if the document was actually created after the IEP team? So we look at the date that it was sent, or we look at the creation date. We look to make sure that that student's name is listed in the to box. This is just an example of the student notice of meeting. It automatically goes to whoever the student is up here. And if I look, this one was sent on the 1st of March. The IEP is held on the 13th of March. So we're okay with that one as far as the timeline. This is just a plain notice of meeting form that we use for all IEPs or all special education documents. This is the one where we have to make sure, I didn't put a name in here. His name is 16 to 21 sample, but we're going to send it to mom and we're going to send it to sample. Even though he's still listed in regarding to sample, it has to be listed in this to box in order for it to be compliant. We're not just going to talk about the student, we're also going to invite the student to their own IEP. This one is, again, March 1st, it was sent out. The IEP is held on March 13th. So we're good with the timeline on that one. Are there any questions on the student notice of meeting or the notice of meeting forms? So then the final requirement for indicator 13 is evidence that a representative of any participating agency was invited to the IEP meeting with the prior consent of a parent or student. Very confusing way to say, do I have a consent form from a parent signed that says it's okay to invite participating outside agency personnel? If we have, I think I had said this when we were going through the transition services, if we're going to list in the transition services that one of the providers is going to be somebody from an outside agency, or if there's a chance that an outside agency might be paying for services, we must invite them to the IEP meeting. But before we can invite them, we have to show that the parents are okay with having them come to the meeting. So we have to have this consent form signed. If I have a student that's 18, and is the age of majority, parents are not guardians, it's the student that signs this consent form to invite the outside agency. Another thing about this consent to invite outside agency form, it has to be completed annually, every year. I know a few years back, people were doing it when the student was a freshman and it was carrying all the way through high school. There court cases have come up in some of the OSEP documents on stating that that's not appropriate because the students and the parents have the right to change their mind as to who will be invited to the IEP meeting. So this has to be conducted annually instead of one time. I do have a court case that, or not a court case, I do have a letter. Every once in a while, OSEP provides guidance to the states through what they call letters from OSEP to somebody. So this Nan Gray had asked a question about, is it permissible to go ahead and obtain consent when the child is a freshman that carries all the way through high school? And OSEP's comment was a separate consent must be obtained from the parents or child who has reached the age of majority, conducted in accordance with those codes of federal regulations that you see listed there. If I were to show you more of the Code of Federal Regulations, they actually state that we should receive consent each time an IEP team meeting is held. But we're just asking that you get the consent form signed, not each time that an IEP meeting is held, but just annually. An example of the consent form, one thing that we look for on this one, we want to make sure that this date is going to align with the IEP. So if the IEP was held on March 3rd, this one March 1st to May 25th, that one would align. Sometimes we get them and we have an IEP that was held prior to this date, but this date was in there. So it really doesn't cover the fact that we have this person participating at a meeting because they were there prior to the date. Sometimes we have one the year before that carries through and then we just sign another one and we sign another one. That's fine because it's going to cover all the time, no matter who is invited. I had another thought and I just lost it. So who might be invited? What kind of agencies are we looking at? Here's a list of some, but you can see on the bottom I have others listed because I know that there's possibly in each community a different adult service agency that might have a representative there. I remember what I was going to say. If a parent is the one that brings the outside service representative to the meeting, there does not have to be a consent form signed. Sometimes parents just show up and they say, oh, by the way, I brought Jim from Job Corps. He's going to sit in today. It's the parent. If the parent is okay with that and they bring them, that's fine. The only way that we know that the parent brought them is if you put a little comment in the present level somewhere that says parents brought Bob from Job Corps because they felt it would be appropriate for the students' post-secondary needs or whatever reason, but just put a little comment that it was the parent that invited them, and then you won't be marked out of compliant if you don't have that consent to invite outside agency. If the parents were not the one that chose to invite them and it was a school that chose to invite them, then we should have that consent form signed. Here's an example of what the consent form looks like. Or no, this is not an example of what the consent form looks like. This I included in here because this is available to every district, every teacher that is teaching transition age students across the state. Why did I include it? This is the internal monitoring document that we use when we look at each case manager's IEP. And this is the one we mark yes, no for each of those requirements that we just went through today. So what this could be used for, if you wanted to, you could pull one of your transition IEPs that you wrote, and you could either self-monitor your own IEP to determine whether or not you feel it meets compliance in each of those 8 requirement areas, or you could have a colleague go ahead and score you on those 8 requirement areas and then talk about why they feel yes, you were compliant or no, you weren't compliant, or maybe I have some units across the state where transition coordinators are using this throughout the school year to do transition monitoring on or with their students, maybe in the middle of the school year instead of summer months, and then they know where they're at prior to when the state monitoring comes up in the summer months. I wanted to include the
Leah?
Andrew. Yep, Mark.
Did you see there's a question in the chat box?
I did as soon as you said
Jamie?
my name. So I haven't really read it yet. Is it best practice to state in the, yes. You know what? Jamie had asked the question, is it best practice to state in the IEP when parents are asked to invite an outside agency, such as VR, and they say they don't want them there, or the parent doesn't feel it's needed, or is it not necessary? And I think Mark is going to reaffirm what I'm about to say. Anytime that somebody's going to question an IEP, it would be better to have more written in the IEP than to have less written in the IEP. So a comment like that, you know, the parents were asked whether or not they would like a vocational rehabilitation representative invited. They said that they didn't think it was appropriate at this time. It's okay to put that in there. I think it just makes your IEP that much stronger. Mark, would you agree?
Yeah, you know, Leah, and I'm not sure if at the beginning I mentioned that I also coordinate dispute resolution for the state. So when we get complaints, when we have questions arise, a lot goes back. Our investigators start with pulling together the record, what is documented, and from there, the facts are determined. So I would agree wholeheartedly. It's probably not black and white, but it makes things a lot more clear and communicates to all parties the intent or what happened.
Or another reason I think it would be beneficial to include it. Let's say the student is maybe a sophomore and you've asked to invite voc rehab and the parents disagreed. Maybe the student at age 18 turns, agrees that he now wants voc rehab and he's getting angry because they've never been invited in the past. You have that documentation that we were going to invite them, but your parents didn't feel it was appropriate at that time. I think it just backs up the reason as to why you don't have them there. So now we have enough time. I'm going to go through a few more court cases and things that can happen if we end up in litigation with a transition IEP and some of the more common outcomes of an IEP. This first one I have listed on here, Andrew F. Andrew F. was not a student that was old enough to be on a transition IEP yet, but Andrew F. made huge changes in the way that courts are looking at whether or not a student is receiving FAPE. And last time I had provided some instruction or some professional development to some of the teachers across the state. They didn't know who Andrew was. So I did include him in here just to keep spreading the word about who Andrew is. Andrew was a student with autism, and I believe he was 11 years old when this case came out. Andrew, his parents claimed the school did not implement all the provisions set forth in Andrew's IEP. No matter what the student's disability and ability level, the student's plan must be set up so that he or she is making progress within the educational system and is not academically stagnant. So his parents were saying, Andrew is in the school, Andrew's receiving services, but Andrew's not making any progress. He's not receiving any kind of FAPE that's enabling him to be successful as he grows older. And they went on to say maybe even if the progress is not stagnant or flatlined, maybe it's so small or trivial, de minimis, that they have listed in here, so trivial that the student really isn't moving forward or is not going to meet those measurable post-secondary goals. Learning is not occurring. Andrew's IEP did not prove he was making progress, and some of the goals were actually repeated from prior years. So when the attorneys went and they looked at the IEP, they saw that from year to year to year, the goals were copied and pasted. The baseline hadn't changed, the ending level hadn't changed, the goal itself hadn't changed. So they kind of had sided with the parents and said, yeah, if the goals are the same from year to year, and if there's stuff within that IEP that are the same from year to year, we agree that he probably isn't making progress with academics. The courts went on and stated that they did not feel as if Andrew's goals and objectives were challenging him, and they would result in any progress or growth. They stated progress must occur with both academic and functional need, which includes transition if the student is old enough that a student may have. I believe with the Andrew case, I did not put the outcome, but I believe with the Andrew case that the school had to pay for Andrew to attend a private institution for the amount of years that he was going to remain in school. And I wonder if it didn't even go back to the year that they said that he wasn't making progress. So it was also retroactive in that case. What are some things that take us to court or due process hearings with a transition student? Maybe we're not conducting age-appropriate transition assessment. Many times today I said that transition assessment is the most important part of the transition IEP to determine where the student has strengths and preferences and where the student is going to move forward with. Maybe we're not including appropriate measurable post-secondary goals. Maybe they're not occurring after high school. Maybe they're not appropriate to what the student wants to do. I think of this one when I've had parents that have come in and said, oh, this is what my student wants to do when he graduates. And then the parents leave and I have the student one-on-one and you get that relationship established and the student tells me, Mrs. Kugel, I don't want to do that at all. So is it appropriate to the student? Who is it appropriate to? It has to be appropriate to that student. Maybe we didn't provide appropriate transition services that link to all of that other stuff we've talked about, the transition assessment, the measurable post-secondary goals. Maybe they're not individualized to the student. And then you can see the fourth one, we're not linking the IEP with the services. We're not looking at stuff like the things that Mark had talked about earlier to link all of the services, the assessment. You could even include some of that information that Mark had talked about with early warning systems. That could be part of the assessment that we list that led to writing certain goals for students and providing services. And then the final common problem that took IEPs or took cases to the courts was to not develop a summary of performance. We haven't talked about the summary of performance because it's not part of the transition IEP, but it is part of the transition program. Summary of performance is written for any student that exits school, and it provides things that worked well with the student as they were in school, maybe some gains that the student had. It wouldn't hurt to include preferences, interests. It also wouldn't include or hurt to include accommodations that might enable whoever might pick that student up after they graduate. It helps them to see what kind of things might make life a little bit more easier for the student as they move forward. What are some outcomes of some of these cases that had come up in court? One of the most common outcomes is that there's compensatory education services that have to be provided. Some of the compensatory education services are so high in the amount of hours that have to be provided because the courts did not feel that the student was receiving FAPE, that it causes the schools to have to put in either an extra hour in the morning or an extra hour in the afternoon, or even summertime hours that are not the same as the extended school year hours. Maybe the court cases are requiring that you go to a psychologist for a psychoeducational evaluation because they don't feel that the evaluations that were used to write the transition IEP were appropriate. If they don't feel it was appropriate, instead of having that outside psych evaluate, maybe they're just going to ask the school to conduct more age-appropriate transition assessments. Some of the courts, again, if they don't feel that the school has the capability to conduct the age-appropriate transition assessments, they might mandate that an outside provider conduct the age-appropriate transition assessments. And then the school gets along with that outside provider to review the transition assessments to determine the remainder of the IEP. And then, like I had said in the Andrew case, maybe it's a non-public school placement that the school has to pay for. Mark, do you have anything that I might have missed? Yep.
I was just gonna add, I think you're spot on. The other thing that comes out of the complaint process, for example, sometimes when a violation is found, and we haven't had one specific to transition recently, but when a violation is found, there's a requirement to address the individual issue, but then also to address making a determination whether there's a larger system issue that caused that individual violation. So there could be a corrective action that requires the district, the unit, to go back and review all the files of, in this case, transition age students within a certain school building, for example. So I think about that checklist that you shared, Leah. That could actually be an outcome or a corrective action that requires that process on a
And
larger
that was
scale.
this one, right? The district transition requirement.
Right.
I'm sorry, Mark, I just kind of jumped in where you finished. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. I did want to provide some more resources for transition coordinators, transition teachers across the state. North Dakota has a Launch My Life site that has a lot of resources for different things. There's transition checklists that can be used as part of the transition assessment for the students, parents, and professionals to complete. There is resources related to the self-advocacy. The Transition North Dakota app is on the Launch My Life website. It also has Are You Ready ND on there, which can be used as part of the transition assessment, but it also can be used to guide maybe goals that need to be written or maybe transition service activities that could be listed in the IEP. It has different disability service councils from the North Dakota University system. It has the FAFSA report on there. I will go ahead and put the link for Launch My Life in the chat box so that you guys can go ahead and access it. And I'm going to be honest right now, not that I haven't been honest the whole time, but the Launch My Life website has not been getting used a lot. So there is a chance that we may not have Launch My Life North Dakota available for many more years. Another thing that I had included that I usually bring to show you is a book entitled Demystifying Transition Assessment. If anybody saw my book, you can see that it's very well used, very well written, very well highlighted. It's got ear tags all over the place and stickies all over the place because it talks about different transition assessment tools that can be used for different students for different reasons. I included this in the PowerPoint with the ISBN number in case you wanted to order your own. I think I paid maybe $19 or $29 for the book, so it wasn't terribly expensive either. And then I did include the NTACT on there. We had talked about research-based and evidence-based practices earlier. They also have resources for transition planning, post-school data analysis, graduation. They have all of the evidence-based, research-based, plus promising practices and also unestablished practices. Unestablished practices do not mean that they're not good practices. They just haven't had the scientific research backing them yet. But the teachers that are using them, that have put them on NTACT, really do appreciate them and say that they're working quite well. And then they also have what they call the B13 data toolkit. This is another indicator 13 toolkit that you could use to help when writing these transition IEPs. I was also going to mention, I don't know how many people know of the Zaro Center at Oklahoma University. They have assessments for self-determination. They have different curriculum and lesson plans that you can tap into for self-determination. They have transitional education materials and materials for student-led IEPs, and they also have resources for students with significant disabilities. Another one that has stuff for self-determination is imdetermined.org if you've not used that before. So I'm going to go ahead and take some time to put in Zaro Center. I don't have the website yet, but if you search Zaro Center, it'll pull it up. And then the I'm Determined is simply imdetermined.org. And then I had already shared, I put this slide in there just to show that we had those one-pagers, but I did already share all of the one-pagers in the chat link. If you go on to the North Dakota Department of Public Instruction site under the Special Education tab, and then into Secondary Transition, I did upload all of the one-pagers on there. There's that Indicator 13 compliance manual is on there. There's also other transition tools, transition suggestions on the NDDPI website. And there is where I also include my email and my direct line. So if you need anything, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to call me. Don't hesitate to send me an email. I am always willing to work with you, for you. And I think Mark believes the same. I just did not include yours on here, Mark, because I didn't want to take it upon myself to do that.
No, I appreciate that, and I'm happy to try to answer questions, but if it's specific to transition, I will most likely try to connect you with Leah.
Or sometimes you're lucky and you get us in a group and we like that stuff. So I do have a little bit more to share. Mark had talked about some of the comments that were provided by the students. Those comments are taken not from Indicator 13, but Indicator 14. Indicator 14 is something that we ask each transition teacher to share with the students. We have a brochure that we send to the teachers that they should be giving to the students. Anytime you meet with the students at an IEP meeting or visit with students, just remind them that there's this post-secondary outcome survey that's going to be happening a year after they leave high school. What we collect are the answers to those questions, or the answers that Mark had shared earlier. They help to guide us in what is it that maybe we have to change, what things are working well in high schools across the state. If we look at Indicator 14 from last year, we call or we contact every student that has exited high school. When we talk exited, we're talking about students that graduated, we're talking to students that had dropped out, and we're talking to students that had turned 21. These were during the 18-19 school year. So overall, we had 747 students that had exited the program in one way or another. We were able to contact 333 of those students for about a 45% average contact rating. When we look down at the education and employment, measurement A, this 29%, are the number of students that we were able to contact. So out of the 333 of them, 29% of them had gone on to higher education. 62% of them had either been these people that were in higher education and also had a job. So they combine now the competitively employed with the higher education. We had 62% of those 333 that were either in school or working or both. And then measurement C are the students that are still from measurement A and measurement B. So they're the students that attended post-secondary training, the students that were employed, or maybe students that attended some other kind of trainings. These are our apprenticeships. These are on the job training. These are 9-month programs. Maybe they're employed in some other job, like maybe a ranch of the families, or maybe they're in a group home type employment setting. Out of the 333 students that we talked to, we had about 82% of them that was working or going to some kind of training. My concern with the 82%, initially you think 82% is wonderful, but then you still have 18% that's not being met or not being documented. That 18% are the students that are not going into any kind of training program, they're not going into education, and they're not working. So really, they're the students that are not doing much of anything after they graduate. Those are the students that I really kind of am worried about, because what are they doing after graduation, and how could we have helped them when they were in high school to be more successful after they exited? If you look at the education enrollment, we had a majority of our students went to 2-year colleges or to VOTEC colleges. Some of them went to 4-year colleges. We had some that went into job training, and we even had some that had completed a GED after they graduated. Employment settings, most of them are going into some kind of competitive integrated work setting. And then there's a few that are just random, home-based, oil, gas, sheltered setting, military. So I just wanted to share that with you. And then we also asked questions about, did you feel you were ready to exit high school? Those are some of the answers that Mark had shared earlier. And then other questions we ask is, I see that you had dropped out of high school. Can I ask you a reason why? And Mark had provided some of that prior to also.
Hey, Leah, just for a point of clarification, the GED, the students who completed the GED didn't do that after graduation.
These
They
would
would
have
have
been
done
the
that after they
student.
dropped out,
Yeah,
right?
these would have been some of the students that had dropped out, and we asked them, you know, what you've been doing over the last year. Oh, I got my GED. So that 1.8% are the students that had gotten that GED afterwards.
Okay, thank you.
Good point, Mark. I did add just a few comments, and I know this is a busy one, but we had like probably 7 pages of comments from students. This was the one that relates to, how did you feel after you left high school? Were you prepared? Had trouble with reading, had trouble focusing because college is so different from high school. That one tells me a lot. If I know that I have a kid that's going to go to college, it has to be more independent work. It has to be more self-advocacy. This student just said that he didn't feel like he was able to do college because it's so different. There's a lot of comments on they would have liked to have more classes on life skills. Some of the things that tie to life skills, maybe purchasing something major like a car. There's another one down here that says balancing a checkbook, getting a student loan, living on campus versus living at home. I would have liked to have help with that. I would have liked to have help with social and interpersonal skills. There was a few that tie into, I would have liked help with the job skills, more work experience to have in high school would have helped to understand my abilities. That's kind of the whole part of the transition part and trying to get kids out into work experiences so they have that ability to say, oh, I really like that. That might be something I go into, or I didn't care for that at all. There's another life skills, didn't understand housing, taxes, how to pay bills. And then there was a few that talked about mental health supports. So with that, I'm actually at the end of the presentation. We almost get a whole hour. I hope there's not somebody that's going to try to catch the last hour and jump in. But if anybody has any questions, comments, if they would like to share any stories, we could sure do that. If not, I'm going to put the evaluation link in the chat box and I ask that you complete the evaluation link. And if you need anything, again, don't hesitate to contact myself or Mark. Mark, do you have anything?
I don't. Just thank you for leading us through this and for everybody's participation and engagement.
And I want to thank everybody that is participating. I'm going to kind of reiterate what Mark had said at the opening. It's been a very difficult year. I understand some of the difficulties that teachers are having with the virtual. All of a sudden we're face to face. All of a sudden we're totally distant. It's got to be challenging at this time. And I do appreciate what the work that you're putting into it and what you're doing for our students across North Dakota. So thank you very much. And with that, I think I'm going to go ahead and let you go and give you almost an hour and 15 minutes back. Take care of yourselves, guys.
Leah,
Yep.
this
Liz?
is Liz.
I have a question, and I didn't know if it would be relevant to everybody else. But you know, on the annual goals, when those annual goals start to look a little bit like the T3 page, have you ever seen that when you're monitoring?
Yeah. And you know, when they're identical, honestly, Liz, I mark them off when they're identical. If they're similar and a little bit different, I tend to try to give it, you know, credit because I don't like marking people out of compliance.
No, I know you don't.
But
And what I'm trying to do is, you know, I was trying to when I train on this or when I help other people, but you know, like sometimes the goals will list out like do a job shadow, do all that stuff. And technically it's measurable, but I don't know. I kind of didn't know
You
where to
know,
go with that.
what I would do with that one, I'd almost go job shadow. You could list as a T3 activity, but then ask yourself, why does the student need a job shadow? Is there specific skills that you could list as the goal to write a goal related to that job shadow? So I'm
Okay.
trying to help you come up with an example. And it's
Well,
not,
so really then I should steer steer case managers away from that, because I think what they're doing is they're taking a literal interpretation of, you know, like that the annual goal relates to the post-secondary goal. So they're trying to, I mean, make it relate specifically to transition activities. So, I mean, I can easily do that as kind of steer them away from that. And like you said, get back to the skills, you know, have the activities be the activities and the skills that they need to learn be the skills they need to learn.
yeah. And I think that's going to be a little bit easier to address that annual component of that goal also. You know, if I
Right.
have a skill that I'm looking at,
Right.
maybe I start, if it's that job shadowing, maybe it's working on time management or
Right.
something to where the, you know,
Yes. Yes, that makes it a lot clearer, because I like you said, I didn't really, I look at them and I think, well, they're not really wrong,
yeah,
but they just could better be on the T3 page, and then the goals could be something different. So thank you. Thank you very
you're
much.
welcome, ma'am. Take care.
You too.